Profit Over People, Neoliberalism and Global Order by Noam Chomsky. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. Chapter 4 Market Democracy in a Neoliberal Order, Doctrines and Reality. Chapter 5 The Zapatista Uprising. Chapter 6 The Ultimate Weapon. Chapter 7 Hordes of Vigilantes. Chapter 4 Market Democracy in a Neoliberal Order, Doctrines and Reality. Excerpted from the annual Davey Memorial Lecture delivered at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, May 1997. I have been asked to speak on some aspect of academic or human freedom, an invitation that offers many choices. I will keep to some simple ones. Freedom without opportunity is a devil's gift, and the refusal to provide such opportunities is criminal. The fate of the more vulnerable offers a sharper measure of the distance from here to something that might be called civilization. While I am speaking, 1,000 children will die from easily preventable disease, and almost twice that many women will die or suffer serious disability in pregnancy or childbirth for lack of simple remedies and care. UNICEF estimated that to overcome such tragedies, and to ensure universal access to basic social services, would require a quarter of the annual military expenditures of the developing countries, about 10% of U.S. military spending. It is against the background of such realities as these that any serious discussion of human freedom should proceed. It is widely held that the cure for such profound social maladies is within reach. This hope is not without foundation. The past few years have seen the fall of brutal tyrannies, the growth of scientific understanding that offers great promise, and many other reasons to look forward to a brighter future. This discourse of the privileged is marked by confidence and triumphalism. The way forward is known, and there is no other. The basic theme, articulated with force and clarity, is that America's victory in the Cold War was a victory for a set of political and economic principles, democracy and the free market. These principles are the wave of the future, a future for which America is both the gatekeeper and the model. I am quoting the chief political commentator of the New York Times, but the picture is conventional, widely repeated throughout much of the world, and accepted as generally accurate even by critics. It was also enunciated as the Clinton Doctrine, which declared that our new mission is to consolidate the victory of democracy and open markets that had just been won. There remains a range of disagreement. At one extreme, Wilsonian idealists urge continued dedication to the traditional mission of benevolence, and at the other, realists counter that we may lack the means to conduct these crusades of global meliorism, and should not neglect our own interests in the service of others. Within this range lies the path to a better world. Reality seems to me rather different. The current spectrum of public diplomacy debate has as little relevance to policy as its numerous antecedents. Neither the United States nor any other power has been guided by global meliorism. Democracy is under attack worldwide, including the leading industrial countries, at least, democracy in a meaningful sense of the term, involving opportunities for people to manage their own collective and individual affairs. Something similar is true of markets. The assaults on democracy and markets are furthermore related. Their roots lie in the power of corporate entities that are increasingly interlinked and reliant on powerful states, and largely unaccountable to the public. Their immense power is growing as a result of social policy that is globalizing the structural model of the Third World, with sectors of enormous wealth and privilege alongside an increase in the proportion of those who will labor under all the hardships of life, and secretly sigh for a more equal distribution of its blessings, as the leading framer of American democracy, James Madison, predicted 200 years ago. These policy choices are more evident in the Anglo-American societies, but extend worldwide. They cannot be attributed to what the free market has decided, in its infinite but mysterious wisdom, the implacable sweep of the market revolution, Reagan-esque rugged individualism, or a new orthodoxy that gives the market full sway. On the contrary, state intervention plays a decisive role, as in the past, and the basic outlines of policy are hardly novel. Current versions reflect capital's clear subjugation of labor for more than 15 years, in the words of the business press, which often accurately reports the perceptions of a highly class-conscious business community, dedicated to class war. If these perceptions are valid, then the path to a world that is more just and more free lies well outside the range set forth by privilege and power. I cannot hope to establish such conclusions here, but only to suggest that they are credible enough to consider with care. and to suggest further that prevailing doctrines could hardly survive were it not for their contribution to regimenting the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments the bodies of its soldiers. To quote again from Edward Bernays while presenting to the business world the lessons that had been learned from wartime propaganda. Quite strikingly, in both of the world's leading democracies there was a growing awareness of the need to apply the lessons of the highly successful propaganda systems of World War I to the organization of political warfare, as the chairman of the British Conservative Party put the matter 70 years ago. Wilsonian liberals in the United States, including public intellectuals and prominent figures in the developing profession of political science, drew the same conclusions in the same years. In another corner of Western civilization, Adolf Hitler vowed that next time Germany would not be defeated in the propaganda war, and he also devised his own ways to apply the lessons of Anglo-American propaganda to political warfare at home. Meanwhile, the business world warned of the hazard factoring industrialists in the newly realized political power of the masses, and the need to wage war and win the everlasting battle for the minds of men and indoctrinate citizens with the capitalist story until they are able to play back the story with remarkable fidelity, and so on, in an impressive flow, accompanied by even more impressive efforts. To discover the true meaning of the political and economic principles that are declared to be the wave of the future, it is of course necessary to go beyond rhetorical flourishes and public pronouncements and to investigate actual practice and the internal documentary record. Close examination of particular cases is the most rewarding path, but these must be chosen carefully to give a fair picture. There are some natural guidelines. One reasonable approach is to take the examples chosen by the proponents of the doctrines themselves as their strongest case. Another is to investigate the record where influence is greatest and interference least, so that we see the operative principles in their purest form. If we want to determine what the Kremlin meant by democracy and human rights, we will pay little heed to Pravda's solemn denunciations of racism in the United States or state terror in its client regimes, even less to protestation of noble motives. Far more instructive is the state of affairs in the people's democracies of Eastern Europe. The point is elementary, and applies to the self-designated gatekeeper and model as well. Latin America is the obvious testing ground, particularly the Central America-Caribbean region. Here Washington has faced few external challenges for almost a century, so the guiding principles of policy, and of today's neoliberal Washington consensus, are revealed most clearly when we examine the state of the region, and how that came about. It is of some interest that the exercise is rarely undertaken, and if proposed, castigated as extremist or worse. I leave it as an exercise for the reader, merely noting that the record teaches useful lessons about the political and economic principles that are to be the wave of the future. Washington's crusade for democracy, as it is called, was waged with particular fervor during the Reagan years, with Latin America serving as the chosen terrain. The results are commonly offered as a prime illustration of how the United States became the inspiration for the triumph of democracy in our time. To quote the editors of a leading intellectual journal of American liberalism, the most recent scholarly study of democracy describes the revival of democracy in Latin America as impressive but not unproblematic. The barriers to implementation remain formidable, but can perhaps be overcome through closer integration with the United States. The author, Sanford Lakoff, singles out the historic North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, as a potential instrument of democratization. In the region of traditional U.S. influence, he writes, the countries are moving toward democracy, having survived military intervention and vicious civil war. Let us begin by looking more closely at these recent cases, the natural ones given overwhelming U.S. influence, and the ones regularly selected to illustrate the achievements and promise of America's mission. The primary barriers to implementation of democracy, Lakoff suggests, are efforts to protect domestic markets, that is, to prevent foreign, mainly U.S., corporations from gaining even greater control over the society. We are to understand, then, that democracy is enhanced as significant decision-making shifts even more into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, mostly foreign-based. Meanwhile, the public arena is to shrink still further as the state is minimized in accordance with the neoliberal political and economic principles that have emerged triumphant. A study of the World Bank points out that the new orthodoxy represents a dramatic shift away from a pluralist, participatory ideal of politics and towards an authoritarian and technocratic ideal, one that is very much in accord with the leading elements of 20th-century liberal and progressive thought, and in another variant, the Leninist model, the two are more similar than often recognized. Thinking through the background, we gain some useful insight into the concepts of democracy and markets, in the operative sense. Lakoff does not look into the revival of democracy in Latin America, but he does cite a scholarly source that includes a contribution on Washington's crusade in the 1980s. The author is Thomas Carruthers, who combines scholarship with an insider's perspective, having worked on democracy enhancement programs in Reagan's State Department. Carruthers regards Washington's impulse to promote democracy as sincere, but largely a failure. Furthermore, the failure was systematic. Where Washington's influence was least, in South America, there was real progress toward democracy, which the Reagan administration generally opposed, later taking credit for it when the process proved irresistible. Where Washington's influence was greatest, progress was least, and where it occurred, the U.S. role was marginal or negative. His general conclusion is that the U.S. sought to maintain the basic order of quite undemocratic societies and to avoid populist-based change, inevitably seeking only limited, top-down forms of democratic change that did not risk upsetting the traditional structures of power with which the United States has long been allied. The last clause requires a gloss. The term, United States, is conventionally used to refer to structures of power within the United States. The national interest is the interest of these groups, which correlates only weakly with interests of the general population. So the conclusion is that Washington sought top-down forms of democracy that did not upset traditional structures of power with which the structures of power in the United States have long been allied. Not a very surprising fact, or much of a historical novelty. Within the United States itself, top-down democracy is firmly rooted in the constitutional system. One may argue, as some historians do, that these principles lost their force as the national territory was conquered and settled. Whatever one's assessment of those years, by the late 19th century the founding doctrines took on a new and much more oppressive form. When James Madison spoke of rights of persons, he meant persons. But the growth of the industrial economy, and the rise of corporate forms of economic enterprise, led to a completely new meaning of the term. In a current official document, person is broadly defined to include any individual, branch, partnership, associated group, association, estate, trust, corporation or other organization, whether or not organized under the laws of any state or any government entity, a concept that would have shocked Madison and others with intellectual roots in the Enlightenment and classical liberalism. These radical changes in the conception of human rights and democracy were introduced primarily not by legislation but by judicial decisions and intellectual commentary. Corporations, which previously had been considered artificial entities with no rights, were accorded all the rights of persons, and far more, since they are immortal persons, and persons of extraordinary wealth and power. Furthermore, they were no longer bound to the specific purposes designated by state charter but could act as they chose, with few constraints. Conservative legal scholars bitterly opposed these innovations, recognizing that they undermine the traditional idea that rights inhere in individuals, and undermine market principles as well. But the new forms of authoritarian rule were institutionalized, and along with them the legitimation of wage labor, which was considered hardly better than slavery in mainstream American thought through much of the 19th century, not only by the rising labor movement but also by such figures as Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party, and the establishment media. These are topics with enormous implications for understanding the nature of market democracy. Again, I can only mention them here. The material and ideological outcome helps explain the understanding that democracy abroad must reflect the model sought at home, top-down forms of control, with the public kept to a spectator role, not participating in the arena of decision-making, which must exclude these ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, according to the mainstream of modern democratic theory. But the general ideas are standard and have solid roots in the tradition, radically modified, however, in the new era of collectivist legal entities. Returning to the victory of democracy under U.S. guidance, neither Lakoff nor Carruthers asks how Washington maintained the traditional power structure of highly undemocratic societies. Their topic is not the terrorist wars that left tens of thousands of tortured and mutilated corpses, millions of refugees, and devastation perhaps beyond recovery, in large measure wars against the church, which became an enemy when it adopted the preferential option for the poor, trying to help suffering people to attain some measure of justice and democratic rights. It is more than symbolic that the terrible decade of the 1980s opened with the murder of an archbishop who had become a voice for the voiceless, and closed with the assassination of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals who had chosen the same path, in each case by terrorist forces armed and trained by the victors of the crusade for democracy. One should take careful note of the fact that the leading Central American dissident intellectuals were doubly assassinated, both murdered and silenced. Their words, indeed their very existence, are scarcely known in the United States, unlike dissidents in enemy states, who are greatly honored and admired. Such matters do not enter history as recounted by the victors. In Lakoff's study, which is not untypical in this regard, what survives are references to military intervention and civil wars, with no external factor identified. These matters will not so quickly be put aside, however, by those who seek a better grasp of the principles that are to shape the future, if the structures of power have their way. Particularly revealing is Lakoff's description of Nicaragua, again standard. A civil war was ended following a democratic election, and a difficult effort is underway to create a more prosperous and self-governing society. In the real world, the superpower attacking Nicaragua escalated its assault after the country's first democratic election. The election of 1984 was closely monitored and recognized as legitimate by the Professional Association of Latin American Scholars, LASA, Irish and British parliamentary delegations, and others, including a hostile Dutch government delegation that was remarkably supportive of Reaganite atrocities. The leading figure of Central American democracy, José Figueres of Costa Rica, also a critical observer, nevertheless regarded the elections as legitimate in this invaded country, calling on Washington to allow the Sandinistas to finish what they started in peace. They deserve it. The United States strongly opposed the holding of the elections and sought to undermine them, concerned that democratic elections might interfere with its terrorist war. But that concern was put to rest by the good behavior of the doctrinal system, which barred the reports with remarkable efficiency, reflexively adopting the state propaganda line that the elections were meaningless fraud. Overlooked as well is the fact that as the next election approached on schedule, Washington left no doubt that unless the results came out the right way, Nicaraguans would continue to endure the illegal economic warfare and unlawful use of force that the World Court had condemned and ordered terminated, of course in vain. This time the outcome was acceptable, and hailed in the United States with an outburst of exuberance that is highly informative. At the outer limits of critical independence, columnist Anthony Lewis of the New York Times was overcome with admiration for Washington's experiment in peace and democracy, which showed that we live in a romantic age. The experimental methods were no secret. Thus Time magazine, joining in the celebration as democracy burst forth in Nicaragua, outlined them frankly: to wreck the economy and prosecute a long and deadly proxy war until the exhausted natives overthrow the unwanted government themselves, with a cost to us that is minimal, leaving the victim with wrecked bridges, sabotaged power stations, and ruined farms, and providing Washington's candidate with a winning issue, ending the impoverishment of the people of Nicaragua, not to speak of the continuing terror, better left unmentioned. To be sure, the cost to them was hardly minimal. Carruthers notes that the toll in per capita terms was significantly higher than the number of U.S. persons killed in the U.S. Civil War and all the wars of the 20th century combined. The outcome was a victory for U.S. fair play, a headline in the New York Times exulted, leaving Americans united in joy, in the style of Albania and North Korea. The methods of this romantic age, and the reaction to them in enlightened circles, tell us more about the democratic principles that have emerged victorious. They also shed some light on why it is such a difficult effort to create a more prosperous and self-governing society in Nicaragua. It is true that the effort is now underway, and is meeting with some success for a privileged minority, while most of the population faces social and economic disaster, all in the familiar pattern of Western dependencies. Note that it is this example that led the New Republic editors to laud themselves as the inspiration for the triumph of democracy in our time, joining the enthusiastic chorus. We learn more about the victorious principles by recalling that these same representative figures of liberal intellectual life had urged that Washington's wars must be waged mercilessly, with military support for Latin-style fascists, regardless of how many are murdered, because there are higher American priorities than Salvadoran human rights. Elaborating, New Republic editor Michael Kinsley, who represented the left in mainstream commentary and television debate, cautioned against unthinking criticism of Washington's official policy of attacking undefended civilian targets. Such international terrorist operations cause vast civilian suffering, he acknowledged, but they may be perfectly legitimate if cost-benefit analysis shows that the amount of blood and misery that will be poured in yields democracy, as the world rulers define it. Enlightened opinion insists that terror is not a value in itself, but must meet the pragmatic criterion. Kinsley later observed that the desired ends had been achieved. Impoverishing the people of Nicaragua was precisely the point of the Contra War and the parallel policy of economic embargo and veto of international development loans, which wreck, ed, the economy and create, ed, the economic disaster, that was probably the victorious opposition's best election issue. He then joined in welcoming the triumph of democracy in the free election of 1990. Client states enjoy similar privileges. Thus, commenting on yet another of Israel's attacks on Lebanon, foreign editor H.D.S. Greenway of the Boston Globe, who had graphically reported the first major invasion 15 years earlier, commented that if shelling Lebanese villages, even at the cost of lives, and driving civilian refugees north would secure Israel's border, weaken Hezbollah, and promote peace, I would say go to it, as would many Arabs and Israelis. But history has not been kind to Israeli adventures in Lebanon. They have solved very little and have almost always caused more problems. By the pragmatic criterion, then, the murder of many civilians, expulsion of hundreds of thousands of refugees, and devastation of southern Lebanon is a dubious proposition. Bear in mind that I am keeping to the dissident sector of tolerable opinion, what is called the left, a fact that tells us more about the victorious principles and the intellectual culture within which they find their place. Also revealing was the reaction to periodic Reagan administration allegations of Nicaraguan plans to obtain jet interceptors from the Soviet Union, the United States having coerced its allies into refusing to sell them. Hawks demanded that Nicaragua be bombed at once. Doves countered that the charges must first be verified, but if they were, the United States would have to bomb Nicaragua. Sane observers understood why Nicaragua might want jet interceptors, to protect its territory from CIA overflights that were supplying the U.S. proxy forces and providing them with up-to-the-minute information so that they could follow the directive to attack undefended soft targets. The tacit assumption is that no country has a right to defend civilians from U.S. attack, a doctrine that reigned virtually unchallenged in the mainstream. The pretext for Washington's terrorist wars was self-defense, the standard official justification for just about any monstrous act, even the Nazi Holocaust. Indeed, Ronald Reagan, finding that the policies and actions of the government of Nicaragua constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, declared a national emergency to deal with that threat, arousing no ridicule. By similar logic, the USSR had every right to attack Denmark, a far greater threat to its security, and surely Poland and Hungary when they took steps toward independence. The fact that such pleas can regularly be put forth is again an interesting comment on the intellectual culture of the victors, and another indication of what lies ahead. Let us move on to NAFTA, the historic agreement that may help to advance US-style democracy in Mexico, Lakoff suggests. A closer look is again informative. The NAFTA agreement was rammed through Congress over strenuous popular opposition but with overwhelming support from the business world and the media, which were full of joyous promises of benefits for all concerned, also confidently predicted by the U.S. International Trade Commission and leading economists equipped with the most up-to-date models, which had just failed miserably to predict the deleterious consequences of the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement, but were somehow going to work in this case. Completely suppressed was the careful analysis by the Office of Technology Assessment, the Research Bureau of Congress, which concluded that the planned version of NAFTA would harm most of the population of North America, proposing modifications that could render the agreement beneficial beyond small circles of investment and finance. Still more instructive was the suppression of the official position of the U.S. labor movement, presented in a similar analysis. Meanwhile, labor was bitterly condemned for its backward, unenlightened perspective and crude threatening tactics, motivated by fear of change and fear of foreigners. I am again sampling only from the far left of the spectrum, in this case, Anthony Lewis. The charges were demonstrably false. But they were the only word that reached the public in this inspiring exercise of democracy. Further details are most illuminating and reviewed in the dissident literature at the time and since, but kept from the public eye and unlikely to enter approved history. By now, the tales about the wonders of NAFTA have quietly been shelved, as the facts have been coming in. One hears no more about the hundreds of thousands of new jobs and other great benefits in store for the people of the three countries. These good tidings have been replaced by the distinctly benign economic viewpoint, the experts' view that NAFTA had no significant effects. The Wall Street Journal reports that administration officials feel frustrated by their inability to convince voters that the threat doesn't hurt them and that job loss is much less than predicted by Ross Perot, who was allowed into mainstream discussion, unlike the OTA, the labor movement, economists who strayed from the party line, and of course dissident analysts, because his claims were sometimes extreme and easily ridiculed. Quoting the sad observation of an administration official, the journal reports further that it's hard to fight the critics by telling the truth that the trade pact hasn't really done anything. Forgotten is what the truth was going to be when the impressive exercise in democracy was roaring full steam ahead. While the experts have downgraded NAFTA to no significant effects, dispatching the earlier experts' view to the memory hole, a less than distinctly benign economic viewpoint comes into focus if the national interest is widened in scope to include the general population. Testifying before the Senate Banking Committee in February 1997, Federal Reserve Board Chair Alan Greenspan was highly optimistic about sustainable economic expansion thanks to a typical restraint on compensation increases, which appears to be mainly the consequence of greater worker insecurity, an obvious desideratum for a just society. The February 1997 economic report of the president, taking pride in the administration's achievements, refers more obliquely to changes in labor market institutions and practices as a factor in the significant wage restraint that bolsters the health of the economy. One reason for these benign changes is spelled out in a study commissioned by the NAFTA Labor Secretariat on the effects of the sudden closing of the plant on the principle of freedom of association and the right of workers to organize in the three countries. The study was carried out under NAFTA rules in response to a complaint by telecommunications workers on illegal labor practices by Sprint. The complaint was upheld by the U.S. National Labor Relations Board, which ordered trivial penalties after years of delay, standard procedure. The NAFTA study, by Cornell University labor economist Kate Bronfenbrenner, was authorized for release by Canada and Mexico, but delayed by the Clinton administration. It reveals a significant impact of NAFTA on strikebreaking. About half of union organizing efforts are disrupted by employer threats to transfer production abroad, for example, by placing signs reading Mexico transfer job in front of a plant where there is an organizing drive. The threats are not idle. When such organizing drives nevertheless succeed, employers close the plant in whole or in part at triple the pre-NAFTA rate, about 15% of the time. Plant closing threats are almost twice as high in more mobile industries, e.g., manufacturing versus construction. These and other practices reported in the study are illegal, but that is a technicality, on a par with violations of international law and trade agreements when outcomes are unacceptable. The Reagan administration had made it clear to the business world that their illegal anti-union activities would not be hampered by the criminal state, and successors have kept to this stand. There has been a substantial effect on destruction of unions, or in more polite words, changes in labor market institutions and practices that contribute to significant wage restraint within an economic model offered with great pride to a backward world that has not yet grasped the victorious principles that are to lead the way to freedom and justice. What was stressed outside the mainstream about the goals of NAFTA is also now quietly conceded. The real goal was to lock Mexico into the reforms that had made it an economic miracle, in the technical sense of this term, a miracle for U.S. investors and the Mexican rich, while the population sank into misery. The Clinton administration forgot that the underlying purpose of NAFTA was not to promote trade but to cement Mexico's economic reforms, Newsweek correspondent Mark Levinson loftily declares, failing only to add that the contrary was loudly proclaimed to ensure the passage of NAFTA, while critics who pointed out this underlying purpose were largely excluded from the free market of ideas by its owners. Perhaps someday the likely reasons will be conceded too. Locking Mexico into these reforms, it was hoped, would deflect the danger detected by a Latin America strategy development workshop in Washington in September 1990. It concluded that relations with the brutal Mexican dictatorship were fine, though there was a potential problem. A democracy opening in Mexico could test the special relationship by bringing into office a government more interested in challenging the U.S. on economic and nationalist grounds, no longer a serious problem now that Mexico is locked into the reforms by treaty. The U.S. has the power to disregard treaty obligations at will, not Mexico. In brief, the threat is democracy, at home and abroad, as the chosen example again illustrates. Democracy is permissible, even welcome, but again, as judged by outcome, not process. NAFTA was considered to be an effective device to diminish the threat of democracy. It was implemented at home by effective subversion of the democratic process, and in Mexico by force, over substantial but vain public protest. The results are now presented as a hopeful instrument to bring American-style democracy to benighted Mexicans. A cynical observer aware of the facts might agree. Once again, the chosen illustrations of the triumph of democracy are natural ones, and are interesting and revealing as well, though not quite in the intended manner. The announcement of the Clinton Doctrine was accompanied by a prize example to illustrate the victorious principles, the administration's achievement in Haiti. Since this is again offered as the strongest case, it is appropriate to look at it. True, Haiti's elected president was allowed to return, but only after the popular organizations had been subjected to 3 years of terror by forces that retained close connections to Washington throughout. The Clinton administration still refuses to turn over to Haiti 160,000 pages of documents on state terror seized by U.S. military forces, to avoid embarrassing revelations about U.S. government involvement with the coup regime, according to Human Rights Watch. It was also necessary to put President Aristide through a crash course in democracy and capitalism, as his leading supporter in Washington described the process of civilizing the troublesome priest. The device is not unknown elsewhere, as an unwelcome transition to formal democracy is contemplated. As a condition on his return, Aristide was compelled to accept an economic program that directs the policies of the Haitian government to the needs of civil society, especially the private sector, both national and foreign. U.S. investors are designated to be the core of Haitian civil society, along with wealthy Haitians who backed the military coup, but not the Haitian peasants and slum dwellers who organized a civil society so lively and vibrant that they were even able to elect their own president against overwhelming odds, eliciting instant U.S. hostility and efforts to subvert Haiti's first democratic regime. The unacceptable acts of the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders in Haiti were reversed by violence, with direct U.S. complicity, not only through contacts with the state terrorists in charge. The Organization of American States declared an embargo. The Bush and Clinton administrations undermined it from the start by exempting U.S. firms, and also by secretly authorizing the Texaco Oil Company to supply the coup regime and its wealthy supporters in violation of the official sanctions, a crucial fact that was prominently revealed the day before U.S. troops landed to restore democracy but has yet to reach the public, and is another unlikely candidate for the historical record. Now democracy has been restored. The new government has been forced to abandon the democratic and reformist programs that scandalized Washington, and to follow the policies of Washington's candidate in the 1990 election, in which he received 14% of the vote. The background of this triumph provides no little insight into the political and economic principles that are to lead us to a glorious future. Haiti was one of the world's richest colonial prizes, along with Bengal, and the source of a good part of France's wealth. It has been largely under U.S. control and tutelage since Wilson's Marines invaded 80 years ago. By now the country is such a catastrophe that it may scarcely be habitable in the not-too-distant future. In 1981 a USAID World Bank development strategy was initiated, based on assembly plants and agro-export, shifting land from food for local consumption. USAID forecast a historic change toward deeper market interdependence with the United States in what would become the Taiwan of the Caribbean. The World Bank concurred, offering the usual prescriptions for expansion of private enterprises and minimization of social objectives, thus increasing inequality and poverty and reducing health and educational levels. It may be noted, for what it is worth, that these standard prescriptions are offered side by side with sermons on the need to reduce inequality and poverty and improve health and educational levels. In the Haitian case, the consequences were the usual ones: profits for U.S. manufacturers and the Haitian superrich, and a decline of 56% in Haitian wages through the 1980s, in short, an economic miracle. Haiti remained Haiti, not Taiwan, which had followed a radically different course, as advisers must surely know. It was the effort of Haiti's first democratic government to alleviate the growing disaster that called forth Washington's hostility and the military coup and terror that followed. With democracy restored, USAID is withholding aid to ensure that cement and flour mills are privatized for the benefit of wealthy Haitians and foreign investors, Haitian civil society, according to the orders that accompanied the restoration of democracy, while barring expenditures for health and education. Agribusiness receives ample funding, but no resources are made available for peasant agriculture and handicrafts, which provide the income of the overwhelming majority of the population. Foreign-owned assembly plants that employ workers, mostly women, at well below subsistence pay under horrendous working conditions benefit from cheap electricity, subsidized by the generous supervisor. But for the Haitian poor, the general population, there can be no subsidies for electricity, fuel, water, or food. These are prohibited by IMF rules on the principled grounds that they constitute price control. Before the reforms were instituted, local rice production supplied virtually all domestic needs, with important linkages to the domestic economy. Thanks to one-sided liberalization, it now provides only 50%, with the predictable effects on the economy. Haiti must reform, eliminating tariffs in accord with the stern principles of economic science, which, by some miracle of logic, exempt U.S. agribusiness. It continues to receive huge public subsidies, increased by the Reagan administration to the point where they provided 40% of growers' gross incomes by 1987. The natural consequences are understood. A 1995 USAID report observes that the export-driven trade and investment policy that Washington mandates will relentlessly squeeze the domestic rice farmer, who will be forced to turn to the more rational pursuit of agro-export for the benefit of U.S. investors, in accord with the principles of rational expectations theory. By such methods, the most impoverished country in the hemisphere has been turned into a leading purchaser of U.S.-produced rice, enriching publicly subsidized U.S. enterprises. Those lucky enough to have received a good Western education can doubtless explain that the benefits will trickle down to Haitian peasants and slum dwellers ultimately. The prize example tells us more about the meaning and implications of the victory for democracy and open markets. Haitians seem to understand the lessons, even if doctrinal managers in the West prefer a different picture. Parliamentary elections in April 1997 brought forth a dismal 5% of voters, the press reported, thus raising the question, did Haiti fail U.S. hope? We have sacrificed so much to bring them democracy, but they are ungrateful and unworthy. One can see why realists urge that we stay aloof from crusades of global meliorism. Similar attitudes hold throughout the hemisphere. Polls show that in Central America, politics elicits boredom, distrust, and indifference in proportions far outdistancing interest or enthusiasm among an apathetic public, which feels itself a spectator in its democratic system and has general pessimism about the future. The first Latin America survey, sponsored by the EU, found much the same. The survey's most alarming message, the Brazilian coordinator commented, was the popular perception that only the elite had benefited from the transition to democracy. Latin American scholars observe that the recent wave of democratization coincided with neoliberal economic reforms, which have been harmful for most people, leading to a cynical appraisal of formal democratic procedures. The introduction of similar programs in the richest country in the world has had similar effects, as already discussed. Let us return to the prevailing doctrine that America's victory in the Cold War was a victory for democracy and the free market. With regard to democracy, the doctrine is partially true, though we have to understand what is meant by democracy: top-down control to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. What about the free market? Here too, we find that doctrine is far removed from reality, as the example of Haiti once again illustrates. Consider again the case of NAFTA, an agreement intended to lock Mexico into an economic discipline that protects investors from the danger of a democracy opening. It is not a free trade agreement. Rather, it is highly protectionist, designed to impede East Asian and European competitors. Furthermore, it shares with the global agreement such anti-market principles as intellectual property rights restrictions of an extreme sort that rich societies never accepted during their period of development, but that they now intend to use to protect home-based corporations, to destroy the pharmaceutical industry in poorer countries, for example, and, incidentally, to block technological innovations, such as improved production processes for patented products allowed under the traditional patent regime. Progress is no more a desideratum than markets, unless it yields benefits for those who count. There are also questions about the nature of trade. Over half of U.S. trade with Mexico is reported to consist of intra-firm transactions, up about 15% since NAFTA. Already a decade ago, mostly U.S.-owned plants in northern Mexico, employing few workers and with virtually no linkages to the Mexican economy, produced more than 33% of the engine blocks used in U.S. cars, and 75% of other essential components. The post-NAFTA collapse of the Mexican economy in 1994, exempting only the very rich and U.S. investors, protected by U.S. government bailouts, led to an increase of U.S.-Mexico trade as the new crisis, driving the population to still deeper misery, transformed Mexico into a cheap, i.e., even cheaper, source of manufactured goods, with industrial wages one-tenth of those in the U.S., the business press reports. According to some specialists, half of U.S. trade worldwide consists of such centrally managed transactions, and much the same is true of other industrial powers, though one must treat with caution conclusions about institutions with limited public accountability. Some economists have plausibly described the world system as one of corporate mercantilism, remote from the ideal of free trade. The OECD concludes that oligopolistic competition and strategic interaction among firms and governments rather than the invisible hand of market forces condition today's competitive advantage and international division of labor in high-technology industries, implicitly adopting a similar view. Even the basic structure of the domestic economy violates the neoliberal principles that are hailed. The main theme of the standard work on U.S. business history is that modern business enterprise took the place of market mechanisms in coordinating the activities of the economy and allocating its resources, handling many transactions internally, another large departure from market principles. There are many others. Consider, for example, the fate of Adam Smith's principle that the free movement of people across borders, for example, is an essential component of free trade. When we move on to the world of transnational corporations, with strategic alliances and critical support from powerful states, the gap between doctrine and reality becomes substantial. Public statements have to be interpreted in the light of these realities, among them Clinton's call for trade not aid for Africa, with a series of provisions that just happen to benefit U.S. investors and uplifting rhetoric that manages to avoid such matters as the long record of such approaches and the fact that the United States already had the most miserly aid program of any developed country even before the grand innovation. Or to take the obvious model, consider Chester Crocker's outline of Reagan administration plans for Africa in 1981. We support open market opportunities, access to key resources, and expanding African and American economies, he said, and want to bring African countries into the mainstream of the free market economy. The statement may seem to surpass cynicism, coming from the leaders of the sustained assault against the free market economy. But Crocker's rendition is fair enough, when it is passed through the prism of really existing market doctrine. The market opportunities and access to resources are for foreign investors and their local associates, and the economies are to expand in a specific way, protecting the minority of the opulent against the majority. The opulent, meanwhile, merit state protection and public subsidy. How else can they flourish, for the benefit of all? Of course, the United States is not alone in its conceptions of free trade, even if its ideologues often lead the cynical chorus. The gap between rich and poor countries from 1960 is substantially attributable to protectionist measures of the rich, a UN development report concluded in 1992. The 1994 report concluded that the industrial countries, by violating the principles of free trade, are costing the developing countries an estimated $50 billion a year, nearly equal to the total flow of foreign assistance, much of it publicly subsidized export promotion. The 1996 Global Report of the UN Industrial Development Organization estimates that the disparity between the richest and poorest 20% of the world population increased by over 50% from 1960 to 1989, and predicts growing world inequality resulting from the globalization process. That growing disparity holds within the rich societies as well, the United States leading the way, Britain not far behind. The business press exults in spectacular and stunning profit growth, applauding the extraordinary concentration of wealth among the top few % of the population, while for the majority, conditions continue to stagnate or decline. The corporate media, the Clinton administration, and the cheerleaders for the American way proudly offer themselves as a model for the rest of the world. Buried in the chorus of self-acclaim are the results of deliberate social policy of recent years, for example, the basic indicators just published by UNICEF, revealing that the United States has the worst record among the industrial countries, ranking alongside Cuba, a poor third-world country under unremitting attack by the hemispheric superpower for almost 40 years, by such standards as mortality for children under 5. It also holds records for hunger, child poverty, and other basic social indicators. All of this takes place in the richest country in the world, with unparalleled advantages and stable democratic institutions, but also under business rule, to an unusual extent. These are further auguries for the future, if the dramatic shift away from a pluralist, participatory ideal of politics and towards an authoritarian and technocratic ideal proceeds on course, worldwide. It is worth noting that in secret, intentions are often spelled out honestly. For example, in the early post-World War II period, George Kennan, one of the most influential planners and considered a leading humanist, assigned each sector of the world its function. Africa's function was to be exploited by Europe for its reconstruction, he observed, the United States having little interest in it. A year earlier, a high-level planning study had urged that cooperative development of the cheap foodstuffs and raw materials of northern Africa could help forge European unity and create an economic base for continental recovery, an interesting concept of cooperation. There is no record of a suggestion that Africa might exploit the West for its recovery from the global meliorism of the past centuries. In this review, I have tried to follow a reasonable methodological principle, to evaluate the praise for the political and economic principles of the world dominant power by keeping primarily to illustrations selected by the advocates themselves, as their strongest cases. The review is brief and partial, and deals with matters that are obscure and not well understood. My own judgment, for what it is worth, is that the sample is fair enough, and that it yields a sobering picture of the operative principles as well as of the likely wave of the future if they prevail unchallenged. Even if accurate, the picture is seriously misleading, precisely because it is so partial. Missing entirely are the achievements of those who really are committed to the fine principles proclaimed, and to principles of justice and freedom that reach far beyond. This is primarily a record of popular struggle seeking to erode and dismantle forms of oppression and domination, which sometimes are all too apparent but are often so deeply entrenched as to be virtually invisible, even to their victims. The record is rich and encouraging, and we have every reason to suppose that it can be carried forward. To do so requires a realistic assessment of existing circumstances and their historical origins, but that is of course only a bare beginning. Skeptics who dismiss such hopes as utopian and naive have only to cast their eyes on what has happened right here in South Africa in the last few years, a tribute to what the human spirit can accomplish, and its limitless prospects. The lessons of these remarkable achievements should be an inspiration to people everywhere, and should guide the next steps in the continuing struggle here too, as the people of South Africa, fresh from one great victory, turn to the still more difficult challenges that lie ahead. Chapter 5. The Zapatista Uprising. Major changes have taken place in the global order in the past quarter century. By 1970, the affluent alliance of the post-war years was running onto the rocks, and there was growing pressure on corporate profits. Recognizing that the United States was no longer able to play the role of international banker that had been so beneficial to US-based multinationals, Richard Nixon dismantled the international economic order, the Bretton Woods system, suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold, imposing wage price controls and an import surcharge, and initiating fiscal measures that directed states' power, beyond the previous norm, to welfare for the rich. These have been the guiding policies since, accelerated during the Reagan years and maintained by the New Democrats. The unremitting class war waged by business sectors was intensified, increasingly on a global scale. Nixon's moves were among several factors that led to a huge increase in unregulated financial capital and a radical shift in its use, from long-term investment and trade to speculation. The effect has been to undermine national economic planning as governments are compelled to preserve market credibility, driving any economies toward a low-growth, high-unemployment equilibrium. Cambridge University economists John Eatwell comments, with stagnating or declining real wages, increasing poverty and inequality, and booming markets and profits for the few. The parallel process of internationalization of production provides new weapons to undermine working people in the West, who must accept an end to their luxurious lifestyle and agree to flexibility of labor markets, not knowing whether you have a job tomorrow, the business press orates happily. The return of most of Eastern Europe to its Third World origins enhances these prospects considerably. The attack on workers' rights, social standards, and functioning democracy throughout the world reflects these victories. The triumphalism among narrow elite sectors is quite understandable, as is the despair and anger outside privileged circles. The New Year's Day uprising of Indian peasants in Chiapas can readily be understood in this general context. The uprising coincided with the enactment of NAFTA, which the Zapatista army called a death sentence for Indians, a gift to the rich that will deepen the divide between narrowly concentrated wealth and mass misery, and destroy what remains of the indigenous society. The NAFTA connection is partly symbolic, the problems are far deeper. We are the product of 500 years of struggle, the Zapatistas' declaration of war stated. The struggle today is for work, land, housing, food, healthcare, education, independence, freedom, democracy, justice, and peace. The real background, the Vicar General of the Chiapas Diocese added, is complete marginalization and poverty and the frustration of many years trying to improve the situation. The Indian peasants are the most aggrieved victims of Mexican government policies. But their distress is widely shared. Anyone who has the opportunity to be in contact with the millions of Mexicans who live in extreme poverty knows that we are living with a time bomb, Mexican columnist Pilar Valdez observed. In the past decade of economic reform, the number of people living in extreme poverty in rural areas increased by almost a third. Half the total population lacks resources to meet basic needs, a dramatic increase since 1980. Following International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Bank prescriptions, agricultural production was shifted to export and animal feeds, benefiting agribusiness, foreign consumers, and affluent sectors in Mexico. While malnutrition became a major health problem, agricultural employment declined, productive lands were abandoned, and Mexico began to import massive amounts of food. Real wages in manufacturing fell sharply. Labor's share in gross domestic product, which has risen until the mid-1970s, has since declined by well over a third. These are standard concomitants of neoliberal reforms. IMF studies show a strong and consistent pattern of reduction of labor share of income under the impact of its stabilization programs in Latin America, economist Manuel Pastor observes. The Mexican Secretary of Commerce hailed the fall in wages as an inducement to foreign investors. So it is, along with repression of labor, lax enforcement of environmental restrictions, and the general orientation of social policy to the desires of the privileged minority. Such policies are naturally welcomed by the manufacturing and financial institutions that are extending their control over the global economy, with the assistance of mislabeled free trade agreements. NAFTA is expected to drive large numbers of farm workers off the land, contributing to rural misery and surplus labor. Manufacturing employment, which declined under the reforms, is expected to fall more sharply. A study by Mexico's leading business journal, El Financiero, predicted that Mexico would lose almost a quarter of its manufacturing industry and 14% of its jobs in the first 2 years. Economists predict that several million Mexicans will probably lose their jobs in the first 5 years after the accord takes effect, Tim Golden reported in the New York Times. These processes should depress wages still further while increasing profits and polarization, with predictable effects in the United States and Canada. A large part of the appeal of NAFTA, as its more forthright advocates regularly stressed, is that it locks in the neoliberal reforms that have reversed years of progress in labor rights and economic development, bringing mass impoverishment and suffering along with enrichment for the few and for foreign investors. To Mexico's economy generally, this economic virtue has brought little reward, the London Financial Times observes, reviewing 8 years of textbook market economic policies that produced little growth, most of it attributable to unparalleled financial assistance from the World Bank and the United States. High interest rates have partially reversed the huge capital flight that was a major factor in Mexico's debt crisis. Thought debt service is a growing burden, its largest component now being the internal debt owed to the Mexican rich. Not surprisingly, There was substantial opposition to the plan to lock in this model of development. Historian Seth Fain, writing from Mexico City, described large demonstrations against NAFTA, well articulated, if too little noticed in the United States, cries of frustration against government policies involving repeal of constitutional labor, agrarian, and education rights stipulated in the nation's popularly revered 1917 Constitution that appear to many Mexicans as the real meaning of NAFTA and U.S. foreign policy here. Los Angeles Times correspondent Juanita Darling reported the great anxiety of Mexican workers about the erosion of their hard-won labor rights, likely to be sacrificed as companies, trying to compete with foreign companies, look for ways to cut costs. A communication of Mexican bishops on NAFTA condemned the agreement along with the economic policies of which it is a part because of their deleterious social effects. The bishops reiterated the concern of the 1992 Conference of Latin American Bishops that the market economy does not become something absolute to which everything is sacrificed, accentuating the inequality and the marginalization of a large portion of the population, the likely impact of the NAFTA and similar investor rights agreements. The reaction of the Mexican business world was mixed. The most powerful elements favored the agreement, while mid-sized and small businesses, and their organizations, were dubious or hostile. The leading Mexican journal Excelsior predicted that NAFTA would benefit only those Mexicans who are today the masters of almost the entire country. 15% receive more than half the GDP, a demexicanized minority, and would be another stage of the history of the United States in our country, one of unchecked abuses and looting. The agreement was also opposed by many workers, including the largest non-governmental union, and other groups, which warned of the impact on wages, workers' rights, and the environment, the loss of sovereignty, the increased protection for corporate and investor rights, and the undermining of options for sustainable growth. Homero Oregis, president of Mexico's leading environmental organization, deplored the third conquest that Mexico has suffered. The first was by arms, the second was spiritual, the third is economic. It did not take long for such fears to be realized. Shortly after the NAFTA vote in Congress, workers were fired from Honeywell and GE plants for attempting to organize independent unions. The Ford Motor Company had fired its entire workforce in 1987, eliminating the union contract and rehiring workers at far lower salaries. Forceful repression suppressed protests. Volkswagen followed suit in 1992, firing its 14,000 workers and rehiring only those who renounced independent union leaders, with government backing. These are central components of the economic miracle that is to be locked in by NAFTA. A few days after the NAFTA vote, the U.S. Senate passed the finest anti-crime package in history, Senator Orrin Hatch, calling for 100,000 new police, high-security regional prisons, boot camps for young offenders, extension of the death penalty and harsher sentencing, and other onerous conditions. Law enforcement experts interviewed by the press doubted that the legislation would have much effect on crime because it did not deal with the causes of social disintegration that produce violent criminals. Primary among these are the social and economic policies polarizing American society, carried another step forward by NAFTA. The concepts of efficiency and health of the economy preferred by wealth and privilege offer nothing to the growing sectors of the population that are useless for profit-making, driven to poverty and despair. If they cannot be confined to urban slums, they will have to be controlled in some other way. Like the timing of the Zapatista rebellion, the legislative coincidence was of more than mere symbolic significance. The NAFTA debate focused largely on job flows, about which little is understood. But a more confident expectation is that wages will be held down rather broadly. Many economists think NAFTA could drag down pay, Stephen Pearlstein reported in the Washington Post, expecting that lower Mexican wages could have a gravitational effect on the wages of Americans. That is expected even by NAFTA advocates, who recognize that less skilled workers, about 70% of the workforce, are likely to suffer wage loss. The day after the congressional vote approving NAFTA, the New York Times ran its first review of the expected effects of the treaty on the New York region. The review was upbeat, consistent with the enthusiastic support throughout. It focused on the expected gainers, sectors based in and around finance, the region's banking, telecommunications, and service firms, insurance companies, investment houses, corporate law firms, the PR industry, management consultants, and the like. It predicted that some manufacturers might gain, primarily in high-tech industry, publishing, and pharmaceuticals, which will benefit from the protectionist measures designed to ensure that major corporations control the technology of the future. In passing, the review mentioned that there will also be losers, predominantly women, blacks and Hispanics, and semi-skilled production workers generally. That is, most of the population of a city where 40% of children already live below the poverty line, suffering health and educational disabilities that lock them into a bitter fate. Noting that real wages have fallen to the level of the 1960s for production and non-supervisory workers, the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, in its analysis of the planned and implemented version of NAFTA, predicted that it could further lock the United States into a low-wage, low-productivity future, though revisions proposed by OTA, labor, and other critics, never admitted to the debate, could benefit the populations in all three countries. The version of NAFTA that was enacted is likely to accelerate a welcome development of transcendent importance. Wall Street Journal: the reduction of U.S. labor costs to below any major industrial country apart from England. In 1985, the U.S. ranked at the high end among the 7 major state capitalist economies, G7, as one would expect of the richest country in the world. In a more integrated economy, the impact is worldwide, as competitors must accommodate. GM can move to Mexico, or now to Poland, where it can find workers at a fraction of the cost of Western labor and be protected by high tariffs and other restrictions. Volkswagen can move to the Czech Republic to benefit from similar protection, taking the profits and leaving the government with the costs. Daimler-Benz can make similar arrangements in Alabama. Capital can move freely, workers and communities suffer the consequences. Meanwhile, the huge growth of unregulated speculative capital imposes powerful pressures against stimulative government policies. There are many factors driving global society towards a low-wage, low-growth, high-profit future, with increasing polarization and social disintegration. Another consequence is the fading of meaningful democratic processes as decision-making is vested in private institutions and the quasi-governmental structures that are coalescing around them, what the Financial Times calls a de facto world government that operates in secret and without accountability. These developments have little to do with economic liberalism, a concept of limited significance in a world in which a vast component of trade consists of centrally managed intra-firm transactions, half of U.S. exports to Mexico pre-NAFTA, for example, exports that never enter the Mexican market. Meanwhile, private power demands and receives protection from market forces, as in the past. The Zapatistas really struck a chord with a large segment of the Mexican populace. Mexican political scientist Eduardo Gallardo commented shortly after the rebellion, predicting that the effects would be wide-ranging, including steps toward breaking down the long-standing electoral dictatorship. Polls in Mexico backed that conclusion, reporting majority support for the reasons given by the Zapatistas for their rebellion. A similar chord was struck worldwide, including the rich industrial societies, where many people recognized the concerns of the Zapatistas to be not unlike their own, despite very different circumstances. Support was further stimulated by imaginative Zapatista initiatives to reach out to wider sectors and to engage them in common or parallel efforts to take control of their lives and fate. The domestic and international solidarity was doubtless a major factor in deterring the anticipated brutal military repression, and has had a dramatic energizing effect on organizing and activism worldwide. The protest of Indian peasants in Chiapas gives only a bare glimpse of time bombs waiting to explode, not only in Mexico. Much of this article originally appeared in These Times, February 21, 1994. Thank you for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, share and subscribe for more. Chapter 6. The Ultimate Weapon. Let's begin with some simple points, assuming conditions that now prevail, not, of course, the terminus of the unending struggle for freedom and justice. There is a public arena in which, in principle, individuals can participate in decisions that involve the general society, how public revenues are obtained and used, what foreign policy will be, etc. In a world of nation-states, the public arena is primarily governmental, at various levels. Democracy functions insofar as individuals can participate meaningfully in the public arena, meanwhile running their own affairs, individually and collectively, without illegitimate interference by concentrations of power. Functioning democracy presupposes relative equality in access to resources, material, informational, and other a truism as old as Aristotle. In theory, governments are instituted to serve their domestic constituencies and are to be subject to their will. A measure of functioning democracy, then, is the extent to which the theory approximates reality, and the domestic constituencies genuinely approximate the population. In the state capitalist democracies, the public arena has been extended and enriched by long and bitter popular struggle. Meanwhile, concentrated private power has labored to restrict it. These conflicts form a good part of modern history. The most effective way to restrict democracy is to transfer decision-making from the public arena to unaccountable institutions, kings and princes, priestly castes, military juntas, party dictatorships, or modern corporations. The decisions reached by the directors of GE affect the general society substantially, but citizens play no role in them. As a matter of principle, we may put aside transparent myth about market and stockholder democracy. Systems of unaccountable power do offer some choices to citizens. They can petition the king or the CEO, or join the ruling party. They can try to rent themselves to GE, or buy its products. They can struggle for rights within tyrannies, state and private, and in solidarity with others, can seek to limit or dismantle illegitimate power, pursuing traditional ideals, including those that animated the U.S. labor movement from its early origins, that those who work in the mills should own and run them. The corporatization of America during the past century has been an attack on democracy and on markets, part of the shift from something resembling capitalism to the highly administered markets of the modern state corporate era. A current variant is called minimizing the state, that is, transferring decision-making power from the public arena to somewhere else, to the people, in the rhetoric of power, to private tyrannies, in the real world. All such measures are designed to limit democracy and to tame the rascal multitude, as the population was called by the self-designated men of best quality during the first upsurge of democracy in the modern period, in 17th-century England, the responsible men, as they call themselves today. The basic problems persist, constantly taking new forms, calling forth new measures of control and marginalization, and leading to new forms of popular struggle. The so-called free trade agreements are one such device of undermining democracy. They are designed to transfer decision-making about people's lives and aspirations into the hands of private tyrannies that operate in secret and without public supervision or control. Not surprisingly, the public doesn't like them. The opposition is almost instinctive, a tribute to the care that is taken to insulate the rascal multitude from relevant information and understanding. Much of the picture is tacitly conceded. We've just witnessed yet another illustration, the effort of the past months to pass fast-track legislation that would permit the executive to negotiate trade agreements without congressional oversight and public awareness. A simple yes or no will do. Fast-track had near-unanimous support within power systems, but as the Wall Street Journal ruefully observed, its opponents may have an ultimate weapon, the majority of the population. The public continued to oppose the legislation despite the media barrage, foolishly believing that they ought to know what is happening to them and have a voice in determining it. Similarly, NAFTA was rammed through over public opposition, which remained firm despite the near-unanimous and enthusiastic backing of state and corporate power, including their media, which refused even to allow the position of the prime opponents, the labor movement, to be expressed while denouncing them for various invented misdeeds. Fast track was portrayed as a free trade issue, but that is inaccurate. The most ardent free trader would strongly oppose fast track if she or he happened to believe in democracy, the issue at stake. That aside, the planned agreements hardly qualify as free trade agreements any more than NAFTA or the GATT-WTO treaties, matters discussed elsewhere. The official reason for fast track was articulated by Deputy U.S. Trade Representative Jeffrey Lang. The basic principle of negotiations is that only one person, the president, can negotiate for the U.S. The role of Congress is to rubber stamp. The role of the public is to watch, preferably, to watch something else. The basic principle is real enough, but its scope is narrow. It holds for trade, but not for other matters, human rights, for example. Here the principle is the opposite. Members of Congress must be granted every opportunity to ensure that the United States maintains its record of non-ratification of agreements, one of the worst in the world. The few enabling conventions even to reach Congress have been held up for years, and even the rare endorsements are burdened with conditions rendering them inoperative in the United States, They are non-self-executing and have specific reservations. Trade is one thing, torture and rights of women and children are another. The distinction holds more broadly. China is threatened with severe sanctions for failing to adhere to Washington's protectionist demands, or for interfering with its punishment of Libyans. But terror and torture elicit a different response. In this case, sanctions would be counterproductive. They would hamper our efforts to extend our human rights crusade to suffering people in China and its domains, just as reluctance to train Indonesian military officers diminishes our ability to positively influence their human rights policies and behavior, as the Pentagon recently explained. The missionary effort in Indonesia therefore must proceed, evading congressional orders. That is only reasonable. It suffices to recall how U.S. military training paid dividends in the early 1960s, and encouraged the military to carry out their necessary tasks, as Defense Secretary Robert McNamara informed Congress and the President after the huge Armaled massacres of 1965, which left hundreds of thousands of corpses in a few months, a staggering mass slaughter, New York Times, that elicited unconstrained euphoria among the men of best quality, the Times included, and rewards for the moderates. Who had conducted it? McNamara had. Particular praise for the training of Indonesian military officers in U.S. universities, very significant factors in setting the new Indonesian political elite, the military, on the proper course. In crafting its human rights policies for China, the administration might have also recalled the constructive advice of a Kennedy military mission to Colombia, as necessary execute paramilitary, sabotage, and/or terrorist activities against known communist proponents, a term that covers peasants, union organizers, human rights activists, etc. The pupils learned the lessons well, compiling the worst human rights record of the 1990s in the hemisphere with increasing U.S. military aid and training. Reasonable people can easily understand, then, that it would be counterproductive to press China too hard on such matters as torture of dissidents or atrocities in Tibet. That might even cause China to suffer the harmful effects of a society isolated from American influence, the reason adduced by a group of corporate executives for removing U.S. trade barriers that keep them from Cuban markets, where they could labor to restore the helpful effects of American influence that prevailed from the liberation 100 years ago through the Batista years, the same influences that have proven so benign in Haiti, El Salvador, and other contemporary paradises, by accident. Yielding profits as well. Such subtle discriminations must be part of the armory of those who aspire to respectability and prestige. Having mastered them, we can see why investors' rights and human rights require such different treatment. The contradiction about the basic principle is only apparent. Propaganda's black holes. It is always enlightening to seek out what is omitted in propaganda campaigns. Fast Track received enormous publicity, but several crucial issues disappeared into the black hole that is reserved for topics rated unfit for public consumption. One is the fact, already mentioned, that the issue was not trade agreements but rather democratic principle, and that in any event the agreements were not about free trade. Still more striking was that throughout the intense campaign, there appears to have been no public mention of the upcoming treaty that must have been at the forefront of concern, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, MAI, a far more significant matter than bringing Chile into NAFTA or other tidbits served up to illustrate why the president alone must negotiate trade agreements, without public interference. The MAI has powerful support among financial and industrial institutions, which have been intimately involved in its planning from the outset. For example, the United States Council for International Business, which, in its own words, advances the global interests of American business both at home and abroad. In January 1996, the Council even published a guide to multilateral agreement on investment, available to its business constituencies and their circles, surely to the media. Even before Fast Track was brought to Congress, the Council requested the Clinton administration to include the MAI under the then pending legislation. The Miami Herald reported in July 1997 apparently the first mention of the MAI in the press, and a rare one. We return to details. Why then the silence during the Fast Track controversy, or about the MAI altogether? A plausible reason comes to mind. Few political and media leaders doubt that were the public to be informed, it would be less than overjoyed about the MAI. Opponents might once again brandish their ultimate weapon, if the facts break through. It only makes sense, then, to conduct the MAI negotiations under a veil of secrecy, to borrow the term used by the former Chief Justice of Australia's High Court, Sir Anthony Mason, condemning his government's decision to remove from public scrutiny the negotiations over an agreement which could have a great impact on Australia if we ratify it. No similar voices were heard here. It would have been superfluous. The veil of secrecy was defended with much greater vigilance in our free institutions. Within the United States, few know anything about the MAI, which has been under intensive negotiation in the OECD since May 1995. The original target date was May 1997. Had the goal been reached, the public would have known as much about the MAI as they do about the Telecommunications Act of 1996, another huge public gift to concentrated private power, kept largely to the business pages. But the OECD countries could not reach agreement on schedule, and the target date was delayed a year. The original and preferred plan was to forge the treaty in the World Trade Organization. But that effort was blocked by third world countries, particularly India and Malaysia, which recognized that the measures being crafted would deprive them of the devices that had been employed by the rich to win their own place in the sun. Negotiations were then transferred to the safer quarters of the OECD, where, it was hoped, an agreement would be reached that emerging countries would want to join, as the London Economist delicately put it, on pain of being barred from the markets and resources of the rich. The familiar concept of free choice in systems of vast inequality of power and wealth. For almost 3 years, the rascal multitude has been kept in blissful ignorance of what is taking place. But not entirely. In the Third World it had become a live issue by early 1997. In Australia, the news broke through in January 1998 in business pages, eliciting a flurry of reports and controversy in the national press. Hence Sir Anthony's condemnation, speaking at a convention in Melbourne. The opposition party urged the government to refer the agreement to the Parliamentary Committee on Treaties before signing it, the press reported. The government refused to provide Parliament with detailed information or to permit parliamentary review. Our position on the MAI is very clear, the government responded. We will not sign anything unless it is demonstrably in Australia's national interest to do so. In brief, we'll do as we choose, or more accurately, as our masters tell us, and following the regular convention, the national interest will be defined by power centres, operating in closed chambers. Under pressure, the government agreed a few days later to allow a parliamentary committee to review the MAI. Editors reluctantly endorsed the decision. It was necessary in reaction to the xenophobic hysteria of the scaremongers and the unholy alliance of aid groups, trade unions, environmentalists, and the odd conspiracy theorists. They warned, however, that after this unfortunate concession, it is vitally important that the government does not step back any further from its strong commitment to the MAI. The government denied the charge of secrecy, noting that a draft of the treaty was available on the internet, thanks to the activists groups that placed it there, after it was leaked to them. We can be heartened. Democracy flourishes in Australia after all. In Canada, now facing a form of incorporation into the United States accelerated by free trade, the unholy alliance achieved much greater success. For a year, the treaty has been discussed in leading dailies and news weeklies, on primetime national TV, and in public meetings. The province of British Columbia announced in the House of Commons that it is strongly opposed to the proposed treaty, noting its unacceptable restrictions on elected governments at the federal, provincial, and local levels, its harmful impact on social programs, health care, etc., and on environmental protection and resource management, the extraordinary scope of definition of investment, and other attacks on democracy and human rights. The provincial government was particularly opposed to provisions that allow corporations to sue governments while they remain immune from any liability, and to have their charges settled in unelected and unaccountable dispute panels, which are to be constituted of trade experts, operating without rules of evidence or transparency, and with no possibility of appeal. The veil of secrecy having been shredded by the rude noises from below, it became necessary for the Canadian government to reassure the public that ignorance is in their best interest. The task was undertaken in a national CBC TV debate by Canada's Federal Minister of International Trade, Sergio Marchi. He would like to think that people feel reassured, he said, by the honest approach that I think is exuded by our Prime Minister and the love of Canada that he has. That ought to settle the matter. So democracy is healthy north of the border too. According to CBC, the Canadian government, like Australia, has no plans at this time for any legislation on the MAI, and the Trade Minister says it may not be necessary, since the MAI is just an extension of NAFTA. There has been discussion in the national media in England and France, but I do not know whether there or elsewhere in the free world it was felt necessary to assure the public that their interests are best served by faith in the leaders who love them, exude honesty, and steadfastly defend the national interest. Not too surprisingly, the tale has followed a unique course in the world's most powerful state, where the men of best quality declare themselves the champions of freedom, justice, human rights, and above all, democracy. Media leaders have surely known all along about the MIA and its broad implications, as have public intellectuals and the standard experts. As already noted, the business world was both aware and actively involved. But in a most impressive show of self-discipline, with exceptions that amount to statistical error, the free press has succeeded in keeping those who rely on it in the dark, no simple task in a complicated world. The corporate world overwhelmingly supports the MAI. Though silence precludes citation of evidence, it is a fair guess that the sectors of the corporate world devoted to enlightening the public are no less enthusiastic. But once again, they understand that the ultimate weapon may well be unsheathed if the rascal multitude gets wind of the proceedings. The dilemma has a natural solution. We've been observing it now for almost 3 years. Worthy and unworthy constituencies. Defenders of the MAI have one strong argument: critics do not have enough information to make a fully convincing case. The purpose of the veil of secrecy has been to guarantee that outcome, and the efforts have had some success. That is most dramatically true in the United States, which enjoys the world's most stable and long-lasting democratic institutions and can properly claim to be the model for state capitalist democracy. Given this experience and status, it is not surprising that the principles of democracy are clearly understood in the United States, and lucidly articulated in high places. For example, the distinguished Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington, in his text American Politics, observes that power must remain invisible if it is to be effective. The architects of power in the United States must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight, it begins to evaporate. He illustrated the thesis in the same year, 1981, while explaining the function of the Soviet threat. You may have to sell, intervention or other military action, in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you are fighting. That is what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine. Within these bounds, creating misimpression to delude the public, and excluding them entirely, responsible leaders are to pursue their craft in democratic societies. Nonetheless, it is unfair to charge the OECD powers with conducting the negotiations in secret. After all, activists did succeed in putting a draft version on the internet, having illicitly obtained it. Readers of the alternative press and third world journals, and those infected by the unholy alliance, have been following the proceedings since early 1997 at least. And keeping to the mainstream, there is no gainsaying the direct participation of the organization that advances the global interests of American businesses and their counterparts in other rich countries. But there are a few sectors that have somehow been overlooked, the US Congress, for example. Last November, 25 House representatives sent a letter to President Clinton stating that the MAI negotiations had come to our attention, presumably through the efforts of activists and public interest groups. They asked the president to answer 3 simple questions. First, given the administration's recent claims that it cannot negotiate complicated, multisectoral, multilateral agreements without fast-track authority, how has the MAI nearly been completed, with a text as intricate as NAFTA or GATT and with provisions that would require significant limitations on U.S. laws and policy concerning federal, state, and local regulation of investment? Second, how has this agreement been under negotiation since May 1995, without any congressional consultation or oversight, especially given Congress's exclusive constitutional authority to regulate international commerce? Third, the MAI provides expansive takings language that would allow a foreign corporation or investor to directly sue the U.S. government for damages if we take any action that would restrain enjoyment of an investment. This language is broad and vague and goes significantly beyond the limited concept of takings provided in U.S. domestic law. Why would the US willingly cede sovereign immunity and expose itself to liability for damages under vague language such as that concerning taking any actions with an equivalent effect of an indirect expropriation? On point 3, the signatories might have had in mind the suit by the Ethyl Corporation, famous as the producer of leaded gasoline, against Canada, demanding $250 million to cover losses from expropriation and damages to Ethyl's good reputation caused by Canadian legislation to ban MMT, a gasoline additive. Canada regards MMT as a dangerous toxin and significant health risk, in agreement with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which has sharply restricted its use, and the state of California, which has banned it entirely. The suit also demands damages for the chilling effect of Canada's law, which has caused New Zealand and other countries to review their use of MMT, ethyl charges. Or perhaps the signers were thinking of the suit against Mexico by the U.S. hazardous waste management firm Metalclad, asking $90 million in damages for expropriation because a site they intended to use for hazardous wastes was declared part of an ecological zone. These suits are proceeding under NAFTA rules, which permit corporations to sue governments, according them in effect the rights of national states, not mere persons, as before. The intention presumably is to explore and if possible expand the vague limits of these rules. In part they are probably just intimidation, a standard and often effective device available to those with deep pockets to obtain what they want through legal threats that may be completely frivolous. Considering the enormity of the MI's potential implications, the congressional letter to the President concluded, "We eagerly await your answers to these questions." An answer finally reached the signers, saying nothing. The media were advised of all of this, but I know of no coverage. Another group that has been overlooked, along with Congress, is the population. Apart from trade journals, there was, to my knowledge, no coverage in the mainstream press until mid-1997, and there has been virtually none since. As mentioned, the Miami Herald reported the MAI in July 1997, noting the enthusiasm and direct involvement of the business world. The Chicago Tribune carried a report in December, observing that the matter has received no public attention or political debate, apart from Canada. In the United States, this obscurity seems deliberate, the Tribune reports. Government sources say the administration is not anxious to stir up more debate about the global economy. In the light of the public mood, secrecy is the best policy, relying on the collusion of the information system. The newspaper of record broke its silence a few months later, publishing a paid advertisement by the International Forum on Globalization, which opposes the treaty. The ad quotes a headline in Businessweek, which describes the MAI as the explosive trade deal you've never heard of. The accord would rewrite the rules of foreign ownership, affecting everything from factories to real estate and even securities. But most lawmakers have never even heard of the Multilateral Agreement on Investment because secretive talks by the Clinton administration have been carried out beneath congressional radar, and the media have kept to the White House agenda. Why? The International Forum asks, implicitly answering with a review of the basic features of the treaty. A few days later, February 16, 1998, NPR's Morning Edition ran a segment on the MAI. A week later, the Christian Science Monitor ran a, rather thin, piece. The New Republic had already taken notice of rising public concern over the MAI. The issue had not been properly covered in respectable sectors, the New Republic concluded, because the mainstream press, while generally skewed to the left, is even more deeply skewed toward internationalism. Press lefties therefore failed to recognize the public opposition to fast track in time and have not noticed that the same troublemakers are already girding for battle against the MAI. The press should confront its responsibilities more seriously and launch a preemptive strike against the MAI paranoia that has ricocheted through the internet and even led to public conferences. Mere ridicule of the flat earth and black helicopter crowd may not be enough. Silence may not be the wisest stance if the rich countries are to be able to lock in the liberalization of international investment law just as GATT codified the liberalization of trade. On April 1, 1998, The Washington Post brought the news to a national audience in an opinion piece by editorial staffer Fred Hyatt. He offers the ritual derision of critics and of the claim of secrecy. The text was, after all, placed, illicitly, on the web by activists. Like others who sink to this level of apologetics, He fails to draw the obvious consequences, that the media should gracefully exit the stage. Any meaningful evidence they use could be discovered by ordinary folk with diligent search, and analysis commentary debate are declared irrelevant. Hyatt writes that the MAI hasn't yet attracted much attention in Washington in particular, in his journal a year after the first date for signing passed, and 3 weeks before the 1998 target date. He limits his coverage to a few vacuous official comments, presented as unquestioned fact, and adds that the government has learned from Fast Track that they have to consult, while treaties are still being shaped, more than ever before unions, local officials, environmentalists as others. As we have observed, perhaps in reaction to the congressional letter or the surfacing of the crazies, Washington issued an official statement on the MAI on February 17, 1998. The statement, by Undersecretary of State Stuart Esenstadt and Deputy U.S. Trade Representative Jeffrey Lang, received no notice to my knowledge. The statement is boilerplate, but deserves front-page headlines by the standards of what had already appeared, essentially nothing. The virtues of the MAI are taken as self-evident, no description or argument is offered. On such matters as labor and the environment, takings, etc., the message is the same as the one delivered by the governments of Canada and Australia: trust us, and shut up. Of greater interest is the good news that the United States has taken the lead at the OECD in ensuring that the agreement complements our broader efforts, hitherto unknown, in support of sustainable development and promotion of respect for labor standards. Esenstadt and Lang are pleased that participants agree with us on these matters. Furthermore, the other OECD countries now agree with us on the importance of working closely with their domestic constituencies to build a consensus on the MAI. They join us in understanding that it is important for domestic constituencies to have a stake in this process. In the interest of greater transparency, the official statement adds, the OECD has agreed to make public the text of the draft agreement, perhaps even before the deadline is reached. Here we have, at last, a ringing testimonial to democracy and human rights. The Clinton administration is leading the world, it proclaims, in ensuring that its domestic constituencies play an active role in building a consensus on the MAI. Who are the domestic constituencies? The question is readily answered by a look at the uncontested facts. The business world has had an active role throughout. Congress was not informed, and the annoying public, the ultimate weapon, was consigned to ignorance. A straightforward exercise in elementary logic informs us exactly who the Clinton administration takes to be its domestic constituencies. That is a useful lesson. The operative values of the powerful are rarely articulated with such candor and precision. To be fair, they are not a U.S. monopoly. The values are shared by state-private power centers in other parliamentary democracies, and by their counterparts in societies where there is no need to indulge in rhetorical flourishes about democracy. The lessons are crystal clear. It would take real talent to miss them, and to fail to see how well they illustrate Madison's warnings over 200 years ago, when he deplored the daring depravity of the times as the Starkjabbers will become the Praetorian band of the government, at once its tools and its tyrant, bribed by its largesses, and overawing it by clamors and combinations. These observations reach to the core of the MAI. Like much of public policy in recent years, particularly in Anglo-American societies, the treaty is designed to undercut democracy and rights of citizens by transferring even more decision-making authority to unaccountable private institutions, the governments for whom they are the domestic constituencies, and the international organizations with whom they share common interests. The terms of the MAI. What do the terms of the MAI actually state, and portend? If the facts and issues were allowed to reach the public arena, what would we discover? There can be no definite answer to such questions. Even if we had the full text of the MAI, a detailed list of the reservations introduced by signatories, and the entire verbatim record of the proceedings, we would not know the answers. The reason is that the answers are not determined by words, but by the power relations that impose their interpretations. 2 centuries ago, in the leading democracy of his day, Oliver Goldsmith observed that laws grind the poor, and rich men make the law the operative law, that is, whatever fine words may say. The principle remains valid. These are, again, truisms, with broad application. In the U.S. Constitution and its amendments, one can find nothing that authorizes the grant of human rights, speech, freedom from search and seizure, the right to buy elections, etc., to what legal historians call collectivist legal entities, organic entities that have the rights of immortal persons, rights far beyond those of real persons, when we take into account their power, and rights now being extended to those of states, as we have seen. One will search the UN Charter in vain to discover the basis for the authority claimed by Washington to use force and violence to achieve the national interest, as defined by the immortal persons who cast over society the shadow called politics, in John Dewey's evocative phrase. The U.S. Code defines terrorism with great clarity, and U.S. law provides severe penalties for the crime. But one will find no wording that exempts the architects of power from punishment for their exercises of state terror, not to speak of their monstrous clients, as long as they enjoy Washington's good graces. Suharto, Saddam Hussein, Mobutu, Noriega, and others great and small. As the leading human rights organizations point out year after year, virtually all U.S. foreign aid is illegal. From the leading recipient on down the list, because the law bars aid to countries that engage in systematic torture. That may be law, but is it the meaning of the law? The MAI falls into the same category. There is a worst-case analysis, which will be the right analysis if power remains in the dark, and the corporate lawyers who are its hired hands are able to establish their interpretation of the purposely convoluted and ambiguous wording of the draft treaty. There are less threatening interpretations, and they could turn out to be the right ones, if the ultimate weapon cannot be contained, and democratic procedures influence outcomes. Among these possible outcomes is the dismantling of the whole structure and the illegitimate institutions on which it rests. These are matters for popular organization and action, not words. Here one might raise criticism of some of the critics of the MAI, myself included. The texts spell out the rights of investors, not citizens, whose rights are correspondingly diminished. Critics accordingly call it an investor rights agreement, which is true enough, but misleading. Just who are the investors? Half the stocks in 1997 were owned by the wealthiest 1% of households, and almost 90% by the wealthiest tenth. Concentration is still higher for bonds and trusts, comparable for other assets. Adding pension plans leads only to slightly more even distribution among the top fifth of households. The enthusiasm about the radical asset inflation of recent years is understandable. And effective control of the corporation lies in very few institutional and personal hands, with the backing of law, after a century of judicial activism. Talk of investors should not conjure up pictures of Joe Dokes on the plant floor, but of the Caterpillar Corporation, which has just succeeded in breaking a major strike by reliance on the foreign investment that is so highly lauded, using the remarkable profit growth it shares with other domestic constituencies to create excess capacity abroad to undermine efforts by working people in Illinois to resist the erosion of their wages and working conditions. These developments result in no slight measure from the financial liberalization of the past 25 years, which is to be enhanced by the MAI. It is worth noting too that this era of financial liberalization has been one of unusually slow growth, including the current boom, the poorest recovery in post-war history, low wages, high profits, and, incidentally, trade restrictions by the rich. A better term for the MAI and similar endeavors is not investor rights agreements but corporate rights agreements. The relevant investors are collectivist legal entities, not persons as understood by common sense and the tradition, before the days when modern judicial activism created contemporary corporate power. That leads to another criticism. Opponents of the MAI often allege that the agreements grant too many rights to corporations. But to speak of granting too many rights to the king, or the dictator, or the slave owner, is to give away too much ground. Rather than corporate rights agreements, these measures might be termed, more accurately, corporate power agreements, since it is hardly clear why such institutions should have any rights at all. When the corporatization of the state capitalist societies took place a century ago, in part in reaction to massive market failures, conservatives, a breed that now scarcely exists, objected to this attack on the fundamental principles of classical liberalism. And rightly so. One may recall Adam Smith's critique of the joint stock companies of his day, particularly if management is granted a degree of independence, and his attitude toward the inherent corruption of private power, probably a conspiracy against the public when businessmen meet for lunch, in his acid view, let alone when they form collectivist legal entities and alliances among them, with extraordinary rights granted, backed, and enhanced by state power. With these provisos in mind, let us recall some of the intended features of the MAI, relying on what information has reached the concerned public, thanks to the unholy alliance. Investors are accorded the right to move assets freely, including production facilities and financial assets, without government interference, meaning a voice for the public. By modes of chicanery familiar to the business world and corporate lawyers, the rights granted to foreign investors transfer easily to domestic investors as well. Among democratic choices that might be barred are those calling for local ownership, sharing of technology, local managers, corporate accountability, living wage provisions, preferences for deprived areas, minorities, women, etc., labor consumer environmental protection, restrictions on dangerous products, small business protection, support for strategic and emerging industries, land reform, community and worker control, that is, the foundations of authentic democracy, labor actions, which could be construed as illegal threats to order, and so on. Investors are permitted to sue governments at any level for infringement on the rights granted them. There is no reciprocity, citizens and governments cannot sue investors. The ethyl and metal-clad suits are exploratory initiatives. No restrictions are allowed on investment in countries with human rights violations, South Africa in the days of constructive engagement, Burma today. It is to be understood, of course, that the Don will not be hampered by such constraints. The powerful stand above treaties and laws. Constraints on capital flow are barred, for example, the conditions imposed by Chile to discourage inflows of short-term capital, widely credited with having insulated Chile somewhat from the destructive impact of highly volatile financial markets subject to unpredictable herd-like irrationality. Or more far-reaching measures that might well reverse the deleterious consequences of liberalizing capital flows. Serious proposals to achieve these ends have been on the table for years, but have never reached the agenda of the architects of power. It may well be that the economy is harmed by financial liberalization, as the evidence suggests. But that is a matter of little moment in comparison with the advantages conferred by the liberalization of financial flows for a quarter century, initiated by the governments of the United States and UK, primarily. These advantages are substantial. Financial liberalization contributes to concentration of wealth and provides powerful weapons to undermine social programs. It helps bring about the significant wage restraint and atypical restraint on compensation increases, that appears to be mainly the consequence of greater worker insecurity that so encourage Fed Chair Alan Greenspan and the Clinton administration, sustaining the economic miracle that arouses awe among its beneficiaries and deluded observers, particularly abroad. There are few surprises here. The designers of the post-World War II international economic system advocated freedom of trade but regulation of capital. That was the basic framework of the Bretton Woods system of 1944, including the charter of the LMF. One reason was the, rather plausible, expectation that liberalization of finance would impede freedom of trade. Another was the recognition that it would serve as a powerful weapon against democracy and the welfare state, which had enormous public support. Regulation of capital would allow governments to carry out monetary and tax policies and to sustain full employment and social programs without fear of capital flight, U.S. negotiator Harry Dexter White pointed out, with the agreement of his British counterpart, John Maynard Keynes. Free flow of capital, in contrast, would create what some international economists call a virtual Senate, in which highly concentrated financial capital imposes its own social policies on reluctant populations, punishing governments that deviate by capital flight. The Bretton Woods assumptions largely prevailed during the golden age of high levels of growth of the economy and productivity, and extension of the social contract, through the 1950s and 1960s. The system was dismantled by Richard Nixon with the support of Britain, and, later, other major powers. The new orthodoxy became institutionalized as part of the Washington Consensus. Its outcomes conform rather well to the expectations of the designers of the Bretton Woods system. Enthusiasm for the economic miracles wrought by the new orthodoxy is ebbing, however, among the managers of the global economy, as the near disasters that have accelerated since financial flows were liberalized from the 1970s, have begun to threaten the domestic constituencies as well as the general public. Chief economist of the World Bank Joseph Stiglitz, the editors of the London Financial Times, and others close to the centers of power have begun to call for steps to regulate capital flows, following the lead of such bastions of respectability as the Bank for International Settlements. The World Bank has also somewhat reversed course. Not only is the global economy very poorly understood, but serious weaknesses are becoming harder to ignore and patch over. There may be changes, in unpredictable directions. Returning to the MAI, signatories are to be locked in for 20 years. That is a US government proposal, according to the spokesperson for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, who doubles as senior advisor of investment and trade for IBM Canada, and is selected to represent Canada in public debate. The treaty has a built-in ratchet effect, a consequence of provisions for standstill and rollback. Standstill means that no new legislation is permitted that is interpreted as non-conforming to the MAI. Rollback means that governments are expected to eliminate legislation already on the books that is interpreted as non-conforming. Interpretation, in all cases, is by you-know-who. The goal is to lock countries into arrangements that, over time, will shrink the public arena more and more, transferring power to the approved domestic constituencies and their international structures. These include a rich array of corporate alliances to administer production and trade, relying on powerful states that are to maintain the system while socializing cost and risk for nationally based transnational corporations, virtually all TNCs, according to recent technical studies. The target date for signing the MAI was April 27, 1998, but as it approached, it became clear that delays would be likely because of rising popular protest and disputes within the club. According to rumors filtering through the organs of power, mainly the foreign business press, these include efforts by the European Union and the United States to allow certain rights to constituent states, EU efforts to gain something like the vast internal market that US-based corporations enjoy, reservations by France and Canada to maintain some control over their cultural industries, a far greater threat to smaller countries, and European objections to the more extreme and arrogant forms of US market interference, such as the Helms-Burton Act. The Economist reports further problems. Labor and environmental issues, which barely featured at the start, are becoming harder to suppress. It is becoming more difficult to ignore the paranoids and flat-earthers who want high standards written in for how foreign investors treat workers and protect the environment, and their fervent attacks, spread via a network of internet websites, have left negotiators unsure how to proceed. One possibility would be to pay attention to what the public wants. But that option is not mentioned. It is excluded in principle, since it would undermine the whole point of the enterprise. Even if deadlines are not met and the effort is abandoned, that wouldn't show that it has all been for nothing, The Economist informs its constituency. Progress has been made, and with luck, parts of MAI could become a blueprint for a global WTO accord on investment, which the recalcitrant developing countries may be more willing to accept after a few years of battering by market irrationalities, the subsequent discipline imposed on the victims by the world rulers, and growing awareness by elite elements that they can share in concentrated privilege by helping to disseminate the doctrines of the powerful, however fraudulent they may be. However others may fare. We can expect parts of MAI to take shape elsewhere, perhaps in the IMF, which is suitably secretive. From another point of view, further delays have given the rascal multitude more opportunity to rend the veil of secrecy. It is important for the general population to discover what is being planned for them. The efforts of governments and media to keep it all under wraps, except to their officially recognized domestic constituencies, are surely understandable. But such barriers have been overcome by vigorous public action before, and can be again. Chapter 7. Hordes of Vigilantes. Chapter 6 went to press a few weeks before the April 1998 target date for signing of the MAI by the OECD countries. At the time, it was fairly clear that agreement would not be reached, and it was not an important event, worth considering carefully as a lesson in what can be achieved by the ultimate weapon of popular organizing and activism, even under highly inauspicious circumstances. In part, the failure resulted from internal disputes, for example, European objections to the US federal system and the extraterritorial reach of US laws, concerns about maintaining some degree of cultural autonomy, and so on. But a much more significant problem was looming: massive public opposition worldwide. It was becoming increasingly difficult to ensure that the rules of global order would continue to be written by the lawyers and businessmen who plan to benefit and by governments taking advice and guidance from these lawyers and businessmen, while invariably, The thing missing is the public voice, the Chicago Tribune's accurate description of the negotiations for the MAI, as well as ongoing efforts to craft rules for global activity in other domains without public interference. It was, in short, becoming more difficult to restrict awareness and engagement to sectors identified by the Clinton administration, with unusual and unintended clarity, as its domestic constituencies. The U.S. Council for International Business, which advances the global interests of American business both at home and abroad, and concentrations of private power generally, but crucially not Congress, which had not been informed, in violation of constitutional requirements, and the general public, its voice stilled by a veil of secrecy that was maintained with impressive discipline during 3 years of intensive negotiations. The problem had been pointed out by the London Economist as the target date approached. Information was leaking through public interest groups and grassroots organizations, and it was becoming harder to ignore those who want high standards written in for how foreign investors treat workers and protect the environment, issues that barely featured as long as deliberations were restricted to the domestic constituencies of the democratic states. As expected, the OECD countries did not reach agreement on April 27, 1998, and we moved to the next phase. One useful consequence was that the national press departed from its virtual silence. In the business pages of the New York Times, economic affairs correspondent Louis Eucatel reported that the target date for the MAI had been delayed 6 months, under popular pressure. Treaties concerning trade and investment usually draw little public attention. Why? And while labor and the environment are not excluded, the director of international trade at the National Association of Manufacturers explained, they are not at the center of the concerns of trade diplomats and the World Trade Organization. But these outsiders are clamoring to make their views known in the negotiations for a treaty that is to be called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, Eucatel commented, with intended irony, I presume, and the clamor sufficed to compel the delay. The Clinton administration, acknowledging the pressure, strove to present the matter in the proper light. Its representative at the MAI negotiations said, there is strong support for measures in the treaty that would advance this country's environmental goals and our agenda on international labor standards. So the clamoring outsiders are pushing an open door. Washington has been the most passionate advocate of their cause, they should be relieved to discover. The Washington Post also reported the delay, in its financial section, blaming primarily the French intelligentsia, who had seized on the idea that the rules of the MAI posed a threat to French culture, joined by Canadians as well. And the Clinton administration showed little interest in fighting for the accord, especially given fervent opposition from many of the same American environmental and labor groups that battled against NAFTA, and that somehow fail to comprehend that their battle is misdirected, since it is the Clinton administration that has been insisting upon environmental goals and international labor standards all along, not an outright facade, since the goals and standards are left suitably vague. That labor battled against NAFTA is the characteristic way of presenting the fact that the labor movement called for a version of NAFTA that would serve the interests of the people of the 3 countries involved, not just investors, and that their detailed critique and proposals were barred from the media, as were the similar analyses and proposals of Congress's Office of Technology Assessment. Time reported that the deadline was missed in no small part because of the kind of activism on display in San Jose, California, referring to a demonstration by environmentalists and others. The charge that the MAI would eviscerate national environmental protections has turned a technical economic agreement into a cause célèbre. The observation was amplified in the Canadian press, which alone in the Western world began to cover the topic seriously, under intense pressure by popular organizations and activists, after only 2 years of silence. The Toronto Globe and Mail observed that the OECD governments were no match for a global band of grassroots organizations, which, with little more than computers and access to the internet, helped derail a deal. The same theme was voiced with a note of despair, if not terror, by the world's leading business daily, the Financial Times of London. In an article headlined Network Guerrillas, it reported that fear and bewilderment have seized governments of industrialized countries as, to their consternation, their efforts to impose the MAI in secret have been ambushed by a horde of vigilantes whose motives and methods are only dimly understood in most national capitals. Naturally enough, they are not among the domestic constituencies, so how can governments be expected to understand them? This week the horde claimed its first success by blocking the agreement on the MAI, The journal continued, and some think it could fundamentally alter the way international economic agreements are negotiated. The Hordes are a terrifying sight. They included trade unions, environmental and human rights lobbyists, and pressure groups opposed to globalization, meaning globalization in the particular form demanded by the domestic constituencies. The rampaging horde overwhelmed the pathetic and helpless power structures of the rich industrial societies. They are led by fringe movements that espouse extreme positions and have good organization and strong finances that enable them to wield much influence with the media and members of national parliaments. In the United States, the much influence with the media was effectively zero, and in Britain, which hardly differed, it reached such heights that Home Secretary Jack Straw of the Labour government conceded over BBC that he had never heard of the MAI. But it must be understood that even the slightest breach in conformity is a terrible danger. The journal goes on to urge that it will be necessary to drum up business support so as to beat back the hordes. Until now, business hasn't recognized the severity of the threat. And it is severe indeed. Veteran trade diplomats warn that with growing demands for greater openness and accountability, it is becoming harder for negotiators to do deals behind closed doors and submit them for rubber stamping by parliaments. Instead, they face pressure to gain wider popular legitimacy for their actions by explaining and defending them in public, no easy task when the hordes are concerned about social and economic security, and when the impact of trade agreements on ordinary people's lives risks stirring up popular resentment and sensitivities over issues such as environmental and food safety standards. It might even become impossible to resist demands for direct participation by lobby groups in WTO decisions, which would violate one of the body's central principles. This is the place where governments collude in private against their domestic pressure groups, says a former WTO official. If the walls are breached, the WTO and similar secret organizations of the rich and powerful might be turned into a happy hunting ground for special interests. Workers, farmers, people concerned about social and economic security and food safety and the fate of future generations, and other extremist fringe elements who do not understand that resources are efficiently used when they are directed to short-term profit for private power, served by the governments that collude in private to protect and enhance their power. It is superfluous to add that the lobbies and pressure groups that are causing such fear and consternation are not the U.S. Council for International Business, the lawyers and businessmen who are writing the rules of global order, and the like, but the public voice that is invariably missing. The collusion in private goes well beyond trade agreements, of course. The responsibility of the public to assume cost and risk is, or should be, well known to observers of what its acolytes like to call the free enterprise capitalist economy. In the same article, Yucatel reports that Caterpillar, which recently relied on excess production capacity abroad to break a major strike, has moved 25% of its production abroad and aims to increase sales from abroad by 50% by 2010. With the assistance of U.S. taxpayers, the Export-Import Bank plays a significant role in Caterpillar's strategy, with low-interest credits to facilitate the operation. Exim credits already provide close to 2% of Caterpillar's $19 billion annual revenue and will rise with new projects planned in China. That is standard operating procedure. Multinational corporations typically rely on the home state for crucial services. In really tough, high-risk, high-opportunity markets, a Caterpillar executive explains, you really have to have someone in your corner, and governments, especially powerful ones, will always have greater leverage than banks and greater willingness to offer low-interest loans, thanks to the largesse of the unwitting taxpayer. Management is to remain in the US, so the people who count will be close to the protector in their corner and will enjoy a proper lifestyle, with the landscape improved as well. The hovels of the foreign workforce will not mar the view. Profits aside, the operation provides a useful weapon against workers who dare to raise their heads, as the recent strike illustrates, and who help out by paying for the loss of their jobs and for the improved weapons of class war. What's more, all of this improves the health of the fairy tale economy, which relies on greater worker insecurity, as the experts explain. In the conflict over the MAI, the lines could not have been more starkly drawn. On one side are the industrial democracies and their domestic constituencies. On the other, the hordes of vigilantes, special interests, and fringe extremists who call for openness and accountability and are displeased when parliaments simply rubber stamp the secret deals of the state-private power nexus. The hordes were confronting the major concentration of power in the world, arguably in world history, the governments of the rich and powerful states, the international financial institutions, and the concentrated financial and manufacturing sectors, including the corporate media. And popular elements won, despite resources so minuscule and organization so limited that only the paranoia of those who demand absolute power could perceive the outcome in the terms just reviewed. That is a remarkable achievement. It's not the only such victory in the same few months. Another was achieved in the fall of 1997, when the administration was compelled to withdraw its proposed fast-track legislation. Recall that the issue was not free trade, as commonly alleged, but democracy, the demand of the Hordes for greater openness and accountability. The Clinton administration had argued, correctly, that it was asking for nothing new, just the same authority its predecessors had enjoyed to conduct deals behind closed doors that are submitted for rubber stamping by parliaments. But times are changing. As the business press recognized when Fast Track faced an unexpected public challenge, opponents of the old regime had an ultimate weapon, the general population, which was no longer satisfied to keep to the spectator role as their betters did the important work. The complaints of the business press echo those of the liberal internationalists of the Trilateral Commission 25 years ago, lamenting the efforts of the special interests to organize and enter the political arena. Their vulgar antics disrupted the civilized arrangements that had prevailed before the crisis of democracy erupted, when Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, as explained by Harvard's Samuel Huntington, soon to become professor of the science of government. And now they are intruding in even more sacred chambers. These are important developments. The OECD powers and their domestic constituencies are of course not going to accept defeat. They will undertake more efficient public relations to explain to the Hordes that they are better off keeping to their private pursuits while the business of the world is conducted in secret, and they will seek ways to implement the MAI in the OECD or some other framework. Efforts are already underway to change the IMF Charter to impose MAI-style provisions as conditions on credits, thus enforcing the rules for the weak, ultimately others. The really powerful will follow their own rules, as when the Clinton administration interrupted its passionate pleas for free trade to slap prohibitive tariffs on Japanese supercomputers that were undercutting US manufacturers, called private, despite their massive dependency on public subsidy and protection. Though power and privilege surely will not rest, nonetheless the popular victories should be heartening. They teach lessons about what can be achieved even when opposing forces are so outlandishly unbalanced as in the MAI confrontation. It is true that such victories are defensive. They prevent, or at least delay, steps to undermine democracy even further, and to transfer even more power into the hands of the rapidly concentrating private tyrannies that seek to administer markets and to constitute a virtual Senate that has many ways to block popular efforts to use democratic forms for the public interest, threat of capital flight, transfer of production, media control, and other means. One should attend carefully to the fear and desperation of the powerful. They understand very well the potential reach of the ultimate weapon, and only hope that those who seek a more free and just world will not gain the same understanding and put it effectively to use. Thank you for watching the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more.